Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill De La Cruz, and I'm very honored to be able to spend some time with you this morning. I want to start with the land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, Snohomish, and Tulalip peoples as we begin to heal. Everett Public Schools is committed to improving the relationship and identify Indigenous people while exploring our true selves. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to the ancestors of this land, and we strive to create equitable outcomes and build a culture of inclusive belonging for all teachers, students, staff, and community. And I just want to ask us all to be open, to have our hearts open, to have our minds open, and to really think about how we work together to build community in a time when we all have challenges and we are all working in a new normal. The theme of my talk this morning is Stronger Together, Strengthening Practices for Equitable Outcomes. And I want to start with a quote by Benjamin Franklin, and it goes like this: "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn." And for those of you who don't know me, the work that I am sharing with you is truly about involvement. It's about all of us working together and being engaged and really thinking about how we create a more inclusive and belonging culture in Everett Public Schools and in our community. And I want to start with just defining the words belonging and inclusion, because they're words that are used quite a bit, especially these days. So belonging for me means that I can be a part of this organization without having to give up a part of myself to do so. And it's a really important aspect of equitable outcomes, a sense of belonging. And it's important because all of us want to feel like we can be our true selves when we go to work. And that's not always the case. I was actually working with a team a couple of weeks ago, and I was having a conversation with a gentleman. And he said, I've been thinking about this since we started our conversation this morning, and I realized that I only bring about 40% of myself to work every day. And so I was really curious to find out, well, what is it that you leave at home? Because it's hard to take a piece of my body and leave it at home. And he said, well, I leave my heart, I leave my vulnerability, sometimes I leave my compassion and empathy. And so the things that he left at home, he was realizing were those things that create his humanity and those things that allow him to connect with other human beings. And so as you think of your own self, as you think about the things I'm sharing with you as I talk with you this morning, think about what you're leaving at home. Think about when you do bring this part of yourself to work, how does that feel? And then think about how that must be for our students and for our community. And so the idea of belonging is really internalized and personal. The idea of inclusion is looking at the systems that we operate in. Do the systems, practices, protocols, and processes in Everett Public Schools allow for us to have equitable outcomes? And I'll explain more about equitable outcomes. Essentially, though, they're opportunity, access, and inclusion are equitable outcomes. Does everyone have the same opportunity? Does everyone have the same access, not only to the opportunities, also to resources to be able to be successful? And is everyone included? And so the title of this talk is Using Culturally Responsive Practices to Create Systems of Belonging and Inclusion. And I use the term culturally responsive practices because I think it's important to, number one, realize that you as a whole represent the entire district. And prior to coming here and starting my business, I worked for Denver Public Schools for 10 years. And in Denver Public Schools, I was the Director of Equity and Inclusion. So I did talks like this, I did development work, I engaged with people, I did coaching work pretty much every day for 10 years. And I had a colleague that I worked with, And she would always remind us that a culturally responsive system that has inclusive and equitable outcomes consists of academic folks, the folks who are in the classroom teaching, administrators, paras, and it also has the operation folks, the people who keep our buildings warm and lit and dry, the folks who feed our students lunch, our front office people, everyone who creates our ability for us to go into the district every day and do our work. And even though that new normal looks different, we still need those operation folks in terms of our IT people and everyone that we call on when we need some help with Zoom or with asynchronous videos or whatever it is. And so when we talk about culturally responsive practices, we're really talking about what is it that everyone can do? What is it that everyone can be a part of in terms of creating a culturally responsive district that has equitable outcomes? And so that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking with you about. Creating cultures of belonging within systems that are inclusive. We're also going to share a little bit about how do we establish a common understanding of what culturally responsive practices and what is within our sphere of influence. How can we impact a system that's this large as one human being? Because we have a lot of roles and we need to understand the impact that we have, the opportunity that we have as teachers, as office professionals, as facilities folks, to really build and strengthen a sense of belonging and inclusion for you all as the adults who are in the buildings and supporting students in a variety of ways, and also for our families and the community. Understanding why this is so critical, especially in the world that we live in today. And then really thinking about how do we promote healthy, sustainable relationships to improve the overall organizational climate and culture. And I would add to that, it's not only about healthy and sustainable relationships, it's also about healthy and sustainable practices. How do we create practices and protocols that are replicable and that can be shared regardless of who's a part of the team? So how do we use these practices to onboard new people? How do we use these every year when we get a new group of students and a new group of families to really be able to strengthen that connection that we all have with each other? So I'm going to talk a little bit about why I do this work, just so you can get to know me, and then I'm going to jump into the heart of what I want to share with you today. So I've been engaged in these conversations around inclusion and belonging for most of my professional career. And much of it was rooted around how do we disrupt systemic racism and how do we do it in a way that doesn't demean or denigrate human beings. And so the reason why that is so important is that to talk about systemic racism, being anti-racist, we have to also talk about the systems and who they were designed for and how they're establishing the results that they are today. And so we have to go all the way back to the late early 1800s and look at the makeup of the people who started education. And what I'll submit to you is that if we go all the way back, we will find that it is mostly white men who were religious and wealthy and owned land and people and created an educational system for mostly young men taught by other men. And that's the system that we operate in today. And the idea of white supremacy simply means that at that time there was a narrative or a mindset that white men thought that they were superior to everyone else. Now, I say that as a point of fact, and I want to make something really clear because I'm aware of that, and because I can say that, it does not mean to me that all white men are racist. In fact, it means just the opposite to me. That white men, especially today, just have a system that was created for their benefit. And so when we look at our opportunity gaps in education, we see that our white students are achieving at a higher level than our students of color, our students with disabilities, our lower socioeconomic students. And so the idea of this work is to really think about how do we redesign the system so that it's not structured from the perspective of one group being superior to another, so that it's not structured from the perspective that one group of people has behavior that is better than another group. And we really look at all of our students having the ability to learn, to excel, and to be fully engaged in whatever content we're delivering to them. And so this work is really important from that perspective to me, because as a person who does not identify as white, I've had issues since I was in elementary school around going home and asking my mom, why are kids asking me if I swam over here? Because I wasn't quite sure what that meant. And I do today, and I realize that it's silly because I was born here, and yet as a young person, I had no idea what that really meant. And so I got involved in this work personally because this is my own work, and it has been for a long time, and it will be for quite a while. Till I die, I'll be doing my own personal work. And I'm fully rooted in this idea of talking about our biases, because that's the way that we are all alike. So what you will find about me is that I'm always looking at ways for us to connect with each other, because I believe there's more things that connect us than divide us. And so I've been a parent, I've had kids in public education, I've been a school board member, a school board president, I've worked with governors and commissioners of education, I've traveled the country working with superintendents, administrators, folks on all sides of the academic structure. And I realize that the way that this system is going to change is not from the top and it's not from the bottom, it's from both and all of us working together. And so what drives me to do this work is I want to make the world a more humane place. That is why I do this. And so my approach is to share with you in a way that I've learned best around how to talk about race issues, how to talk about inclusion, how to talk about belonging, and how to maintain a really strong relationship. And that's through vulnerability. And so Patrick Lencioni wrote a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of Team. And what he talks about is the foundation of that is trust. And he talks about two kinds of trust. He talks about predictive trust. Predictive trust is, to me, the lowest level of trust. It's the kind of trust that says, I know you, I know that you have been on time, and that when we set up this keynote, that you would either be here on time or you would create a video such as the one you're seeing, and it would be ready to go at the time it's needed. That's predictive trust. Vulnerability-based trust is different, because vulnerability-based trust is rooted in our stories. And so the idea of being vulnerable means that I can share my stories with you. I can tell you about myself. I can tell you about my successes. I can tell you about my challenges. I can tell you about what hurts me. And so the ultimate approach to what I'm sharing with you is vulnerability-based trust. And really thinking about how do we infuse vulnerability in a system that it wasn't designed for. Essentially, the education system that we all work in was designed to be equal, and we're attempting to do things that are equitable, that are differentiating, that are looking at the needs of a variety of students versus just a homogeneous group. And so one of the things that's really important is to understand why. And as I said, my why is very important to me, and it really drives everything that I do. The why for me is to create a more humane world. So that's what drives me. That's what drives me to get up in the morning. That's what drives me to coach people, to do development trainings, day in and day out is to make the world a more humane place. It may be something I never see in my lifetime, and yet it continues to drive me. I'm never bored, and I'm never without something to do. And so much so that I served for 6 years on the school board in Boulder, Colorado. I was the president of the board for 2 years. So I've worked really hard to change from within and haven't been as successful. And so this is another way and opportunity to really see if we can truly disrupt a system that was designed to be equal, to be more equitable, so that all of our students succeed and all of you and all of our families feel welcome. And so I can remember a conversation that I had in 1998. I was on the school board from 1997 to 2003. And I remember in 1998 we were talking about our academic gaps. And at the time in Boulder, Colorado, which is a very affluent community in Colorado, had the largest achievement gap in the state. Our black and brown and poor kids and students with disabilities were achieving at 30 to 40% below white students in all academic content areas. And a Latina mom came in to me and she said, "Bill, I need to tell you something. And what I'm going to tell you is that if the statistics were reversed and white children were achieving at the rate of our students of color and our students with disabilities, your boardroom would be a war room and we would be dealing with this like it's a crisis." And so here we are in 2020, and those words still ring true for me, that we still have students who are achieving at a lower level than other students. We still have families who don't have access, who don't have resources. We still have staff like all of you who don't feel included or feel a sense of belonging in an organization that takes up a majority of your time. And so think about your why. Why education? Why are you doing what you're doing? And what drives you to keep showing up day in and day out to do this work? And the other piece I want to say is that we all have a role and we all have a title. And yet as human beings, we are so much more than both of those. And so regardless of what your role or title is, the way that I approach the work of inclusion and belonging is to simply say, when we're doing this work, there are no roles and titles. We are all just a group of people who are working to figure out how do we remove some of the barriers that we're seeing today in our country and in our communities. How do we create acceptance for different perspectives and different points of view, and really realizing that every one of you is so much more than your role and your title. You have a story, you have a life, you have a vulnerable history that's important for us to share with each other, especially if we're going to move from where we are to where I would like us to be in creating connections and having deeper relationships. And so in terms of that role, then I have to think about, so how do I shift my role? How do I shift my thinking? How do I shift my mindset? And that's through practice. And so I have a role, and yet I'm also a human being. And so my mindset is what really drives everything that I do. And so the practices are really wrapped around, how do I shift my thinking? How do I shift my behavior? How do I allow vulnerability to be a part of my daily practices? Practices are just things that we can do for a minute, for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes. And as I get to the end of my talk, I will share with you ways that we can use practices to really create this culture that we want to have. And I couldn't do this talk with you without acknowledging where we are as a country and as a community. I never thought I would live in a time where we would be so divided. And as I see where we are today, it makes me realize that we have a lot of work to do. We've lost a lot of our ability to compromise and our ability to collaborate, and we have a lot of work to do as individuals and as a collective society. And we need to be graceful to each other and to ourselves if we're really going to create a culture of inclusion and belonging. And so I want to shift a little bit and just talk about the human capacity for change, because I think it's really important to understand that there are a lot of ways that we are alike. And one is how we go through change. And I have to talk about change from the state of where we are. The state of where we are is that we have a pandemic that hasn't fully resolved itself. We have a whole redefinition of how we do work and how we do school all over the country and the world. And then we have racial unrest from years and years and years of treatment that has now bubbled up to say we can't ignore it anymore. And with that comes a lot of stress. So as we go through the change process, I think it's important to understand how most of us go through change. Something happens, there's an action or impetus, which we could pick anything. We could pick the pandemic, we could pick the socioeconomic state of our country, we could pick the social unrest around race, we could pick people and losing jobs and homelessness and all the things that are occurring. And I share these things not to be hopeless. I share these things to say that these are the realities of where we are, what we're all working through. Because with that change then comes transition. There's a process that we go through, and that can create a lot of stress. And we have to figure out how do we work through that stress to get the results that we want. And change is a form of loss, and there's trauma that's associated with. Every one of you listening to this has lost some level of your normalcy between all of those things that I've just named. And I don't know, you may know people personally that have suffered and been affected by COVID-19, by the economic state that we're in, by all of these things that are happening. And my heart goes out to you if that is you. And I also understand that change is a form of loss. And so as we go through loss, we have to think about what are the messages that that loss has for our security, for our identity, for our sense of competence, for our sense of direction and relationship. And I couldn't talk to you about culturally responsive practices without acknowledging that I know the state of the world that we are in today. And I understand the challenges that we have in working through this. And I also want you to know that I'm filled with hope. I'm filled with passion, and I know that we can work through this together. And I also know that the students and the young people and the families that we all care about need us to really do our own work so that we can move through this. And I want to share another piece about change and transition. And in typical organizational culture, when something happens, we have where we are. So where we are in February of 2020 was business as usual. Kids were coming to school every day, bus drivers were picking them up, our food service folks were taking care of their food needs, our facilities folks were keeping our buildings safe, and that's where we were. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, and where we were completely changed, and now we have to get to something new, where we have to figure out how do we have school in an environment that may or may not be healthy. How do we have our buildings clean and sanitized in a way that we've never had to do before? And typical organizational change looks at where we are and where we're going and has a straight line and just says, let's go. And if you don't get on board, then you might not be a team player, or you might be looked at as not wanting to really be a part of the change. I think what happens though is we miss the emotional part of change, the emotional part of shock and denial, anger and resistance, growing acceptance, and then finally focused commitment. And when we miss working through, especially shock and denial and anger and resistance, it's really hard to get to growing acceptance. Some of you may still be in shock and denial and anger and resistance. And so the question is, The question is not, how do you get over it? The question is, what is it that you need to do to process yourself through it? Because there is no way out except through. And so I bring that piece to you just to have you think about your own self-care and the care for those people that are part of your life, both in this workplace environment and also in your communities, in your churches, in your homes, the folks that you really care about. And understanding that all of our students are going through that same process. They're going through that same level of shock, denial, anger, resistance, and slowly growing acceptance. And the same for all of our families. And so that's what I mean by giving grace. We have to really think about, how do we create grace for each other? How do we redefine this new normal in a place where normal has been completely disrupted? Even my own life has been changed in this environment, in the way that I do things. Even in this keynote, talking to you through a camera versus being in front of you in person, all in the same room. So being flexible and being adaptable are a large part of where we are today. It's a large part of what we're going to need to be able to move through this, to get to a place where we do education in a completely different way. So I thought it was important for me to share with you the things that I'm bringing into this myself, because what I'm sharing with you is not for me to say this is what you need to do. I'm really saying that this is what I do and what I've been doing and what I will continue to do to move myself through this time that we're in, and that I have to be flexible. I have to adapt. I have to learn new things to be able to be successful. And so we're in this together from that perspective. And so I'm hoping that we can continue to work together as we move forward. So I want to take a few minutes now and talk to you about culturally responsive practices coupled with adaptive leadership. And so the idea of adaptive leadership was coined by a gentleman named Ron Heifetz, and he talks about two types of problems. He talks about technical and adaptive. Technical issues are the kind of things that we've been going through since school changed, having to switch over to Zoom or Teams or Google Hangouts or some other form of video learning to be able to be successful. And the transition into those, while it's been difficult because it's not what we're used to, we have the answers for those, because we have experts who can help us to set up Zoom meetings and team meetings. And I think the biggest challenge from my perspective is I haven't had to do that before, so I had to literally learn all of the ways to run a meeting through a camera. And it was really hard for me because my bias in this work was that it can't be done unless you're in front of people, because you have to feel their emotions. And what I've come to find is that I certainly can do it. That as a facilitator, I can facilitate regardless of what the medium is that I'm using. And is it hard? Absolutely. Does it challenge me more some days than others? Absolutely. My point in sharing that story, though, is that technical issues are things that we have the answer for. We are in an adaptive environment. And by adaptive, what I mean is that no one has the answer. No one has the answer for how to get through COVID or when it's going to be through. No one has the answer for how we're going to redo the workplace, how we're going to redo education. And no one has the answer, certainly, for how to work through social unrest connected to race and to discrimination. And so from an adaptive perspective, dialogue, ideas, and curiosity are valued. And those are the ways that we can really move through the times we are in using an adaptive mindset. So our mindset drives our behaviors. And so as I become really clear that we are in an adaptive time and it's not going to go away anytime soon, I've also become really clear that I have to remain very, very adaptive and very willing to flex to what's happening in my environment. And my environment could be working with you who are watching this today, My environment could be in my home life with my kids, my grandkids, whatever it is. And so the idea of this work for me is really thinking about how does my own life experience, my own personality, drive my ability to then take that into my profession and mix it up enough to the point where I can still be successful. And so as we think about this through the lens of academics and operations, everything that I shared with you is still relevant in terms of we have to be adaptive and figure out how are we going to get kids to school. I know that the adaptability from our food service folks has already been there because they've had to figure out how do we feed our most needy children and get food to our families who we know really need to have that. Our facilities folks are learning and adapting to figure out how do I keep these schools clean when students are there and when staff is there so that people feel confident that we can really do this in a way that doesn't create more harm. And so that's my first step into this, is to really lay the framework for understanding each of your role is really critical. And each of you play a role that without you, we couldn't do this to the degree that we need to. So as we go through the next part of my talk, I want you to really think about what do you need to be able to grow for self-care, for processing through trauma and conflict, and the other things that you're feeling and experiencing. So I want to get into culturally responsive practices because we can look at it from two different perspectives. So culturally responsive practices are the ways that we treat each other, the things that we do. And culturally responsive pedagogy for the academics is the way that we deliver curriculum. I'm going to focus more on the practices because I know that I'm talking to folks from both the academic and the operations side of the district. And I want everyone to know that you all have the ability to create culturally responsive practices. And if we're going to create a culture of inclusion and belonging, we need everything that you all have to offer to make it work. And so culture is really our life experiences. So when we're thinking about culturally responsive, the cultural part is really looking at what is it that I bring to the conversation. Culture is not about understanding the background that every single person has because that would be impossible. I don't have enough time nor enough bandwidth to understand the entire cultural background of everyone on this call. What I do have the ability to do is to create connections with each of you based on a piece of your cultural experience, your lived experience that is relevant to mine. So I came from a home of divorce. I have 5 siblings. I have moved 3 or 4 times. And so those are the types of things. I like to ride my bicycle. I love to listen to music. I love movies, and so those are the types of things, food, art, those are all things that create culture. And so everyone has a culture. The idea of responsiveness is to just be aware that everyone has a culture and that because they're different from mine doesn't make them wrong, and it doesn't make me better or me worse. The understanding of culture responsive is that I know and I can respond to people and situations that are culturally different from mine because of my self-awareness and my ability to be flexible and to adapt. So that's what culturally responsive is. Practices are the things that I do every day that I'm very conscious of to make sure that I'm staying in an accepting place of being culturally responsive versus a place of judgment, blame, and shame. So really thinking about when you put together culturally responsive practices, essentially they are things that we do and ways that we think that create connections to people who are different from us, which for me is pretty much everyone in the world. Because even when I look at people who have my own racial background or ethnic background, they have a completely different life experience than mine. So that means that even people of my own group are going to be different from me based on those life experiences. And so that's really what we're talking about. And so whether you are in transportation or food services or front office staff or an administrative role or teachers or paras, regardless of what your title is, the big work that we're all doing together is really building this culture of inclusion and belonging in an environment that is more challenging than I've ever experienced in my life in terms of divisiveness and in terms of people being unwilling to accept that there are multiple perspectives for everything, or that you don't have to think like me for me to be connected to you. And so I just want you to let that percolate for a while. And my hope is that towards the end of your time together today, that you'll be able to have more conversations about some of these things. So I read a lot, and of course I read a lot about equity and inclusion and racism and connecting and culturally responsive leadership. And I've been reading a book called The Culturally Responsive School Leader, essentially by Dr. Mohammed Khalifa. He's a researcher out of the University of Minnesota. And one of the concepts he talks about is whether we're school-centric or community-centric. So in a school-centric model, what's being talked about is that students and families come in and adapt to the culture of school. And in a community-centric model, what we're talking about is the school adapting to the culture of our community. And I would submit to you that right now, in the world that we're in, our schools are fully having to adapt to the culture of our communities, because our communities are in COVID. Our communities are in a pandemic. Our communities are in social unrest. And now we have to start to think about, how do we keep people safe and bring them into school? How do we talk to our communities about the impacts of race and racism and systemic bias in our communities and in our country? And so these conversations are really important. And so essentially what we're all doing in education is we're moving to this community-centric model where we're really having to adapt to what our community's bringing in. And so a couple of components of culturally responsive leadership is that it's a necessary component of effective leadership. It has to be present and sustainable in schools, and it's foremost and consistently promoted by leaders. Leaders set the standard. So regardless of where you are in the academics or operations side of the house, if you're a leader, you're setting the standard. So if you don't talk about race, if you ignore things that are happening, then the people who follow you are going to model the leader. And so the leadership is really key in this progression that we're moving through to get to culturally responsive practices of inclusion and belonging. And I will tell you that I spent 2 days with the superintendent and his leadership team sharing all of this information. So we are really consciously working at the leadership level as well as throughout the district. And so the other part of Dr. Khalifa's work is that culturally responsive school leadership is characterized by a core set of unique behaviors, namely being critical self-reflection, developing and sustaining culturally responsive teachers, curriculum, and engaging students in indigenous or local neighborhood community resources. So from the frame that he's sharing, indigenous is really about, where do our kids come from? Do we know their communities? Do we know what they're experiencing? Do we know what resources they have and what resources they don't have to be able to be successful? And so culturally responsive leaders that are able to use critical self-reflection as a way to dive deeply into their own understanding of how they behave is a key piece for an inclusive and belonging culture. And, pre-COVID, we had everything set up. Our facilities folks kept our schools clean and safe and bright and warm and cool so that We could all go in and do our work in buildings that we felt safe in. The school bus drivers got kids to school safely. They engaged with them. Food services folks kept our children's brains functioning and fed them every day. Families made sure that the children showed up at school. Everyone played and still plays a very important role in all of our children having a culturally responsive experience in school today. And we have to adapt because schools look different. And yet our students are still our students. I've talked to a number of teachers over the last couple of months where they said, I just don't know how to connect with our students. And so I would talk to them and say, so tell me about the relationships you have with your students when they were in the classroom. And they would talk about how they knew them, how they knew their families, knew what they needed, had really connected with them through story. And then I would ask them, so today, 3 months later, what's different? Are they the same student? Yes. Do you still know where they come from? Yes. So the only difference is now we're having to figure out how to communicate and create those connections through a screen. And so, again, I tell you that story because that has been my own dilemma about how do I connect and create relationships through a screen, especially understanding that I have a bias that says it can't happen. And so some of the ways that you do that from an operations perspective is to engage your folks in relationship building. Talk about how you work through conflict. Create personal agreements about how we're going to treat each other. Ask each other how we're doing, and not just from a cursory perspective, because a lot of times it'll be like, oh, Bill, how's it going? Oh, it's good. And if you see my facial expression, it's not really good. And there's a lot of times where I'll ask somebody, how are you doing? And they'll say, oh, I'm good. And I'll say, no, tell me how you're really doing. Because I really want to know. And we think we don't have time for that, and yet we have to make time for that. And our students need it, and we need it. The other part of this work for me is that the adults set the culture of the building our kids walk into. The adults set the culture of the school bus rides that our children have. And so from that perspective, our role as adults is key and critical, especially at this time where we're not doing things the way that we used to do them. And so from an academic perspective, I'm going to give you a couple of things that you can do. One is called You Had Me at the Door. And I guess I'll have to reframe that to say, you had me at the screen. Meet your students as they come into the Zoom meeting. You can't really get close to them. You can greet them with a compliment or a genuine query into how do they feel, why they look happy, worried, tired, etc. Just doing what you can to let your students know that you still care about them, you still love them, you still see them as a human being as well as a student, and you want to know how they're doing today. So that's one piece. It's called, we'll shift it up and say, you had me at the screen. Community building. Create a team resume or a chart paper where you have students identify their strengths, their honors, their activities, and create this classroom resume where all your students play a role in creating it based on who they are. You could work with your students to create the rules and expectations for the Zoom meetings. Here's the things that we want to do, how we want to treat each other. You can have students sit in small groups, create a team mascot or a team name or anything like that. So just ways to build community. Celebrate success as you move forward. Set goals with the students and hold them accountable. Be a guide on the side and support the moves and directions. Have conferences with them. Ask questions to lead them forward. Encourage them. Tally the positives and not the negatives. And celebrate their strengths. And what I will say is community building and celebrating success as moving forward can happen in both the student population and also with adults. So if you're a leader leading adults, same question. How do you celebrate success? How do you create community building when you're having meetings with your folks and they're all over the city and everyone is watching each other through a camera? So active engagement's happening when we're involved in issues that are regarded as vital. So this is both for students and adults. When they're being helped to see major concepts, big ideas, and general principles, not just isolated facts, but what are the big ideas? Equity, inclusion, and belonging are big ideas. When they're involved in planning for what they are doing, part of what we're doing with this approach is to engage you all in this planning about how do we create an inclusive and belonging Everett School District. This can't be done by one person or one team or one group. We are all involved in this and we all have to play a role. Involved in applying ideas such as fairness, equitable outcomes, and justice for the world. Talk about the issues that are happening in the world. And this transition, this is a challenging time. It's very adaptive and we have to be willing to flex for each other, for our students, for our community. So what I want you to think about is how do you promote healthy and sustainable relationships? How do we get to know each other, tell each other's stories? How do we work through vulnerability, trust? How do we stay engaged? We all have to learn to build relationships and be in community in a completely different way. We've got to model to our students and our communities that we're flexible, that we can adapt, because those are skills our children are going to need to be successful in this next normal. The ways that we did business are not going to be the same for a while. And our students need to know how to be able to flex and be adaptable as well. So I want you to remember to be hopeful. This is a challenging time for us, our students, our families, our community. And I believe that in education, I need to hold myself to a higher standard because the impact I'm having are on our children and our kids in our community. And so as you think about that, I want to invite you into a practice. So I said I'd share with you a practice that I think would be helpful. So this is one related to moving through change. So I'd love for you to think about a major change in your life. Gosh, we could just pick just about anything going on in America today as a major change. The question to ask yourself, though, is what are the major concerns you have about this change? And more importantly, what are you losing? And then the second question is, what are the possible positive impacts of this change? Third question is, what is within and what is outside of your control regarding this change? In other words, what do you have influence over? So using your sphere of influence to be able to really think about how do I move through change? And then one thing that I will do to lead myself through this transition. So these are 4 questions that I think would be really helpful for everyone to go through as we're in this process of change. And to remember that you are all influencers. You all influence some people all the time. And so really thinking about what is your sphere of influence. And while we're talking about your role, we're also talking about your humanity. So my role as an administrator in a district doing equity and inclusion work is to support people, to provide development work, and to show people how to make connections. My role as a human engaging with my colleagues is really to show you that I care, to be available for you, to accept all parts of you so that you feel a sense of belonging and inclusion in whatever environment that we are operating in together. And so you all influence. So really thinking about what is it that you can do to influence this change and to make an impact in what we're doing together as a district. And I'll go back to where I started and really asking you to think about what is it that you need to feel a sense of belonging, personal, in a system that's inclusive, that welcomes you. Because if we can do that for you, if you can do that for you, and you can do that for your colleagues as adults, then all we have to do is model that for our kids and welcome them into a culture of belonging and inclusion. We have what it takes. We have what it takes to make this work. And we have what it takes to reinvent the way we do public education. And I will close by just saying I am so excited to be a part of this with you. And I know what's possible. I know that this can happen. And it can't happen without all of you. So I just want to appreciate you for being here. I hope you have a really great day of learning and engagement. And I'm excited and looking forward to our time together when I can actually be here in real time or in front of you in person. So thank you so much. Have a really great day and continue learning, keep growing, and do your best to support each other and to support our students and families. Thank you and have a really good day.